Um, so welcome to Ground Level's Wednesday Wisdom. Today we have the wonderful Richard Bradbury with us sharing, and we're very excited to hear what you've got to share with us, Richard. And you are going to talk to us on the topic of where is God when it seems the world is falling apart. So
yeah,
that's definitely a very relevant topic to us all at the moment, especially when you hear announcements like this morning about the economy and different bits and pieces floating around like that. So we're really intrigued to hear what you've got to share with us. So over to you, Richard. There will be some time for question and answer at the end. When we come to do that point, just wave and we'll come to you. But there's not many of us, so we shouldn't have too much of a problem with audio and bits and pieces. But if we could just all mute ourselves while Richard's sharing, that would just be really helpful. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
okay, thank you. So in this session, we're going to explore the theology of crisis effectively and find how we find the peace and the presence of God when all the certainties are being challenged. And of course, there's no easy answers to this question, and I'm not going to be providing any glib answers as we go. Rather, I want to explore, drawing upon biblical examples and scholarly insights, how we can encounter God when nothing makes sense. The backdrop to the discussion, of course, is coronavirus, COVID-19. However, the study aims to look at the bigger picture that will equip us to be able to deal with any future crises and also any personal crises as well. In his book, God and the Pandemic, Tom Wright gives us some real insights into the whole area. I think, Helen, you've read that one, haven't you? Yeah. And I'm not going to repeat what he says here, but I will draw on some of his writings to perhaps frame our question. And quite early on, he reminds us that it simply will not do to take a fatalistic, stoic outlook that all things work together for good. In other words, that God is in control and will use any crisis for his greater purposes. He may do, but that does not mean that everything is pre-programmed and that there is nothing that we can do about it. He also tells us that we can't take a Platonic approach and see the world as a shadow of the next, this world as a shadow of the next. Many have posted on social media suggesting that this is another of those signs of the end times being upon us, and soon the rapture will come to rescue us and let the world fall apart. In addition, we can't take the Epicurean approach of seeing everything as random, leaving us with the philosophy of eat, drink and be merry, and for tomorrow we die. As believers, we must see these things through biblical spectacles in order to arrive at a place of peace in the midst of the storm. When we approach the Old Testament, and that's where we start, many see within it the notion of that disasters are as a result of God's judgment on sinful people. And of course, there is some evidence of that when we consider such cases as Sodom and Gomorrah, and indeed the flood narrative, and we'll consider the flood narrative in a moment. However, we also see notable exceptions, which we'll also consider, such as why did the people of Israel end up in slavery in Egypt? Why did Job suffer? And what we must avoid here is importing any notion of paganism into our view of God. In the pagan world, whether that be Egypt, Babylon, Greece, or Rome, the generally held notion was that humanity was the plaything of the gods. You could merit their favor by offering them oblations and sacrifices, and you would incur their wrath by favoring another god or by doing something of which they didn't approve. What you could not do was either have a relationship with them or depend on them, on their grace. As Shakespeare put it in King Lear, Act 4, Scene 1, lines 37 to 38, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. And that was very much the mindset of those in those ancient cultures. These words are spoken by Gloucester as he wanders on the heath, having been blinded by Goneril and Regan, his daughters, and they reflect the profound despair that grips him and drives him to desire his own death. More important, they emphasize one of the play's chief themes, namely the question of whether there is justice in the universe. Gloucester's philosophical musing here offers an outlook of stark despair. He suggests that there is no order, or at least no good order, in the universe, and that man is incapable of imposing his own moral ideas upon the harsh and inflexible laws of the world. Instead of divine justice, there is only the sport of vicious, unscrutable gods who reward cruelty and delight in suffering. In many ways, the events of the play bears out Gloucester's understanding of the world, as the good die along with the wicked, and no reason is offered for the unbearable suffering of that permeates the play. Again, as we are seeing such a morose outlook in the midst of crisis, reflected by atheists such as Richard Dawkins, and this is a quote from one of his books. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to be lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no other good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. And these views all reflect the Epicurean approach that we've already outlined. Either the gods do it to us, or nature does it to us. Either way, we are powerless to avoid such crises. All we can do is weather the storm, hope to survive, and try to enjoy ourselves along the way. And I would suggest that this view is quite common amongst the people we encounter on the street each day, if we could go out on the street each day, that is. It's quite fatalistic and almost as if you have to accept your karma. The Hebrew God of the Bible seems to reflect some of these traits. Perhaps that's why Mani, who was the author of Manichaeanism, came up with the notion, also reflected in Zoroastrianism, that there were in fact two deities, the God of the Old Testament, who was an angry God of judgment, and the God of the New Testament, from whom Jesus came to show the way of the truth. And there is a modern emphasis in scholarship on the notion that the biblical writers drew upon the surrounding culture when they formulated their views of God. Professor Francesca, and I've got to try and pronounce this name, Stavrakopoulou of Exeter University, who presented a BBC Two TV documentary series entitled The Bible's Buried Secrets a few years ago. She popularized this view, this idea that the writers were drawing in from the pagan cultures around her. Interestingly enough, her Twitter name is Greeky Geeky Atheist, so we can see where she was coming from. Certainly the framing of God in the early writings drew upon some of the notions of the world in which the writers existed. For example, the name El was widely used throughout the ancient Near East to describe the senior deity in the pantheon. Also, it's clear that there is an unfolding revelation of God and of spiritual understanding throughout the Old Testament period. For example, it was only from after the return from Babylon that the notions of an afterlife began to be more clearly understood. However, the God we see on the pages of the Old Testament, even in the early books, is markedly different from the gods of the surrounding nations. He is not pernicious or selfish or capricious, unlike the other deities. Rather, his purpose is always to bring things back to divine harmony and order for the good of humanity, even if it means dealing summarily with some of those things that prevent that from happening. Any cursory study of pagan religions of the time would clearly identify Yahweh as completely different and not just a projection of existing beliefs. To suggest that God allowed himself to be presented in a lesser than adequate light so that humanity could identify him is woefully short of the true picture, as is reflected in Greg Boyd's book, Cross Vision. Rather, we're presented with a God who set out from the beginning to redeem fallen humanity and creation, even when they are destroying the world he gave them and whilst they are still in their rebellion. What we must embrace is the fact that the Bible doesn't give us nicely packaged answers to the question of why suffering occurs and how to avoid it. Instead, it helps those who are suffering to explore their own experience of pain against the backdrop of a God who loves them and rescues them. And it's for this reason that so many of the Psalms reflect genuine, raw emotion. They ask questions of God which many of us from Western backgrounds would not dare to ask, such as, my God, why have you forsaken or abandoned me? Which could be translated, why have you allowed me to suffer for so long? As it says in Psalm 22, verse 1. And we'll return to this scripture later on. However, it's in the dialoguing with God that the psalmist or writer finds comfort and renewed hope. And this same psalm finishes with an acknowledgement of the sovereignty and power of God. So let's consider some moments of crises in the Bible, beginning with the flood. Whether or not we believe the flood was a worldwide phenomenon, as the Hebrew suggests here, or as an event local to the Middle East, or a myth, or something else, as we encounter the narrative in the Bible, it marks out the complete destruction of the human race by an angry God. Part of the problem with considering issues such as this is anthropomorphism, that is, the projection of human characteristics and nature onto God. We project onto God human values, emotions, and behaviors. In other words, we see him as a bigger and more powerful version of ourselves. And the reality is that God is so far above our comprehension and understanding that we cannot possibly grasp what he's really like. As Karl Barth suggested, it's actually impossible for us to understand and comprehend God except inasmuch as he chooses to reveal himself to us. And he then cites two means through which we can get some revelation of God: the Bible and the Son. And it's only in the Son that God is truly revealed to humanity. So when we come to think of anger, we think of it in purely human terms, as an explosion of emotion towards something or someone who has upset, violated, or in some other way crossed us. But that's not at all a true reflection of God's anger. The following piece is from a Croatian theologian by Miroslav Volf, for whom it took the horrors of ethnic warfare happening around him to appreciate the goodness of God's wrath. This is what he wrote in a book that's cited in this writing. He says this: I used to think that wrath was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? Yes, God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was as a casualty of the former war in Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed and 3 million were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed. My people shelled day in, day out, and some of them brutalized beyond imagination. And I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How could God react to this carnage? Or how did God react to this carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in parental fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrators' basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. And so here we are presented with an image of God who is justly angry at the evil destruction of his creatures and of his creation. God is not flying off the handle, but slowly seething and with the destructive actions of his creatures and the cry for justice for the oppressed, which rises up to him so that he cannot but take action. And I think in these terms we must encounter the flood narrative, which tells us that God was grieved in his heart, according to Genesis 6:6. In other words, it was out of his deep grief over what humanity was doing to other humans and to the creation that God could see no alternative but to start again. And the situation was completely irredeemable, but for one righteous man and his family. So where was God in the suffering of the world? Trying to redeem the irredeemable. And this answer may not be totally satisfying, but I believe it helps us along the path to considering why such an extreme action is presented as being a divine act. This whole narrative ends in hope with the promise that this was a one-off that would never recur. Now we come to Israel in Egypt. As mentioned above, and as we shall see when we come to consider Job in a moment, a commonly held view in the ancient world was that evil came upon people as a result of their disobedience to God. And this is affirmed in the Deuteronomic law of the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy 28 through 30. However, in the bondage and slavery of Israel in the beginning of the book of Exodus, there is no indication in the text that they'd done anything to deserve their fate. It simply says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. An interesting question in relation to Jacob's death, or after Joseph's, in relation to the Israelites in Egypt, is why they didn't return to the land after the famine or after Jacob or Joseph's death. Jacob took his entire family to Egypt after God clearly told him to go, yet he knew that they would return to the land of promise at some point. One of the reasons it was necessary for them to go was because Jacob's sons had started marrying Canaanite women, and by sending them to Egypt and planting them in Goshen, they were kept separate, distinct, and unique from everyone else. We don't realize when we consider suffering that sometimes God has a greater plan at work, which doesn't justify the suffering, but we should realize that we can't see the whole picture when we're in the midst of suffering. Essentially, a change in regime occurred, resulting in a change of policy towards a minority ethnic group that were living in Egypt, resulting in their oppression. The Egyptian regime felt threatened by the presence of these aliens amongst them, so to assert their own superiority, set them to work in manual labor jobs. How modern does that sound? Not surprisingly, the theologies of oppressed minorities draw heavily upon the Exodus narrative. There is no justice in the treatment of the Israelites by the Egyptians. It's simple expediency. What the Exodus narrative tells us is that when oppressed minorities cry out to God, he is not deaf to their voices. He raised up a deliverer for them, one who was raised in privilege, but chose to identify with their suffering in order to rescue them and bring them out into God's freedom and the inheritance prepared for them. Oh, how that is a model of Jesus, raised up amongst us to rescue us and bring us out into his freedom. So coming back to the question, where was God in their crisis? He was listening to their voices and implementing his rescue plan to bring them out from under oppression. This was the foundation of their national narrative, which has formed and shaped them as a nation ever since. And even now they look for a Messiah who is a new Moses to bring about their national rescue. Unfortunately, they didn't recognize him when he walked amongst them as Jesus of Nazareth. Now we come to Job, and there is no easy way to approach the suffering of Job nor to understand it. It throws up so many paradoxes and leaves many questions unanswered, but perhaps that is what it's supposed to do. It begins with a wager between God and Satan over whether Job only worships God because of the blessing God has poured on him. That in itself is problematic. There then follows, under Satan's direction, but under the allowance of God, some of the worst afflictions that could come upon any person. His children were killed in a freak accident. He loses his business and his wealth. Finally, he loses his health, and we find him scratching himself with a piece of pottery to try and alleviate his sores. And if that wasn't bad enough, 3 friends turn up to console him and basically tell him that he must have done something dreadfully wrong, that he is not owning up to deserve such a punishment as this from the hand of God. Worse still, Eliphaz seems to claim he's had a word from God and so consolidates his advice by claiming divine revelation. They're all reflected in this same commonly held belief that righteousness merits blessing and sin merits cursing. Their worldview will not allow them to see it any other way. In response, Job persistently declares his innocence and his desire to argue his case with God. Finally, God turns up, and his response is to remind all of them that they have no way of understanding him and his actions. Unless they've been around when he put in place the foundations of the earth and formed the whole of creation, they have nothing to say on this subject. In response, Job admits his impudence in contending with the Almighty. He acknowledges that compared to God, he is completely insignificant, so how could he possibly hold God to account for his actions? And this is a question for all those who go down the line of theodicy. Theodicy is trying to justify what God does. Is it for us to justify the ways of God to man, as Milton suggests in Paradise Lost, Book 1, line 26? Can we really sit here and postulate over God's actions and declare whether they are right or wrong? Do we have such knowledge of divinity, of the ways of God, of the depths of his character, that we can make judgment on the morality of his actions? The real reality is that as creator, he could completely obliterate his whole creation and still be justified in doing it. As Paul says in Romans 9:20-21, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this? Or does the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honourable use and another for common use? That doesn't mean that we can't wrestle with God and with Scripture in order to satisfy ourselves on some of these things. As I mentioned earlier, this is exactly what the psalmists do when confronted with severe crises. However, we cannot hope to achieve total understanding of God's ways. It's beyond our capacity as mere mortals to achieve this. And those who come up with seemingly expansive arguments in this respect are either arrogant or self-deceived. This brings us to the place where all our arguments should terminate, at the cross. The key passage when considering this whole question is Philippians 2:5-11. And here we see the humiliation of Jesus in every respect. He laid aside his majesty, his equality with God. He became a servant, entered into the experience of humanity in every respect. And in that form, he entered into the worst suffering that humanity could endure at the cross. And when he did so, he took upon himself the suffering of humanity so that we could ultimately be free of it. He bore our guilt, our sin, our shame, our sickness, our disease, our pain, and he was marred beyond any man. As Jürgen Moltmann said, God in Christ entered into the suffering of all humanity. Thus he entered into our suffering in every respect. And this might not line up with the doctrine of impassibility of God, but it presents us with a God who understands and emphasizes with our suffering, and to whom we can go with all that we confront, knowing that we have a great high priest who intercedes for us, as it says in Hebrews 4:15. So in beginning to pull this all together, missionary Elizabeth Elliot's first husband was killed by a tribal group in India, and afterwards she spent 17 years serving this same group. Then the second husband died of cancer, and she declared that suffering is a terrible truth we as Christians must face, but that suffering is never for nothing in God's dealings with us. When her first husband was killed, the Lord gave her Isaiah 43:2. 6 years ago, my own sister was diagnosed with a spinal tumour. After undergoing surgery to have it removed, she suffered a massive hemorrhage and was paralysed from the waist down. She spent some months in Pinderfields Hospital, and on her discharge she came to live with us for a while. She now lives in her own flat, on her own in a flat, requires a wheelchair for any level of mobility. And this is what she wrote to me when I showed her this talk that I was going to give. She said this: when I was living with you and the Lord spoke to me with a word which you confirmed, he reminded me that he knows the plans he has for me. I can only conclude that suffering is part of that plan. It's not the whole, but a part of it. Nevertheless, he has walked closely with me, provided for me, watched over me, and protected me on this painful journey that I have learned to trust completely in his extraordinary faithfulness, knowing that I'm in his hands. Do I understand why my life has become so painful and so lonely? Not at all. But he hasn't abandoned me to it, and he won't leave me in it. Although it can crush us, suffering makes us fight to overcome it. We learn empathy. We become resourceful, patient, long-suffering. We persevere. In the hands of God, whether he alleviates our suffering or whether he doesn't, he does indeed give us beauty for ashes. I don't think he allows us to suffer so that he can work character in us, but that when we suffer, he uses it to do so if we allow him. And this is continuing what she's saying. As I've said to you before, if we start from the position that everything God does is righteous, just, and true, then we have no basis on which to blame God for suffering. Furthermore, we cannot grasp how much we must suffer in the knowledge that we have rejected the very means by which suffering may be overcome. When the Bible talks of suffering, it's seldom a case of if we suffer, rather when we suffer. Jacob told Pharaoh that Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life in Genesis 47. But he also talked to Joseph of the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, and the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. Through suffering, God draws close to us, walks through it with us, draws us deeper into him, and somehow does a precious work within us. So for me, the answer to the question, where is God in a crisis, is right here with me. He's not ignorant of our suffering or unaware of our questions. And in Gethsemane, in his humanity, Jesus questioned the will of God for him, but then he submitted to it. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame. It's in knowing that he had me in his heart when he suffered more than anyone else has ever suffered that helps me endure when things do not make sense. So that's my conclusion.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. Some great points there. So we'll welcome some question and answer now. Lots of information to digest, so feel free to take a minute and let your brain formulate. But yeah, if you do have a question for Richard, please actually just dive in. I think that's going to be easiest because there's only a few of us. So fire away. Or even any points and reflections on what was shared.
Sorry, can I come in? Sorry, I mean, it's not so much a question. Thank you, Richard, for that. I found it really stimulating. Just an observation on this general subject. I read an article recently, and somebody had done a survey of, I think, the 100 most popular worship songs. I think it was somebody from the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity may have been done that, LICC. And the comment was that out of the top 100, there was only one that addressed the issue of suffering or lament.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority were, and I think he put it something like triumphalistic.
Mm.
Now, you know, we know the kingdom's advancing. I'm sort of, you know, I'm from that church sort of background. But it struck me that was quite significant. And I've been doing, over the last lockdown, a daily thought on the Psalms, journeying through the Psalms with our church on Facebook. And I read something like 28% of the Psalms actually focus on lament.
Mm.
And tied in with that, I guess my favorite Old Testament prophet is Habakkuk, because when I was studying theology at Mattersey, he was the prophet that I chose to write a dissertation on, and I actually knew very little of him. But by the end of it, I sort of, and I don't know whether you obviously know Habakkuk, but he had just had lots and lots of questions.
Yeah.
He saw things around going on, and he just said, Lord, why do the wicked prosper, and why is this happening? And when God said, well, actually, you know, I'm going to use the Chaldeans to punish my people, he said, well, God, they're even more wicked than my people, the people I'm living amongst. And he had this whole dialogue.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that God never actually, it seems to me, resolved those issues in Habakkuk, but Habakkuk resolved that he would accept that God's ways were often unknowable and inscrutable, but God was God. And ultimately he got to a place of acceptance. That no, we don't know the whole picture, as you were saying. We don't know the whole story and why things happen. But, you know, he's able to say at the end, well, even if there aren't any figs on the vine,
yeah,
and basically the cupboard is empty, yeah, I'm going to praise the Lord because he is my sovereign strength. And he will, you know, the sovereign Lord is my strength, and he will enable me to go on to the heights, even in the midst of suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touch on some key issues there. That firstly, we do live in churches generally where we want to be positive and have faith and so on. But I think we need to learn sometimes just that whole thing of being honest with God, that I am feeling like this and I haven't got the answers and I haven't got the revelation at this moment, but that I've got to trust God nevertheless. And that is the place of true faith, I think, not pretending the situation's just going to go away, or that I'm just going to believe and it's going to resolve itself. It's actually taking out honest questions before God. And the whole issue of lament, I think, is one. I think the only, as I've said, I think Helen will have heard me say this at Bible school, I think the only person I've heard write songs of lament in charismatic circles was Godfrey Birtle. He expressed some of that. But I think, again, we want to be upbeat, and that's all part of the character and the nature of the kind of churches we have. But there is a place for that expressing the deeper longings and grievings and sufferings of our hearts, because we're laying them out before God. And I think we need more to learn that.
And I think actually that's why some people get disillusioned with church. It's because you can't maintain that level of, super positivity all the time, and psychologically it's not healthy. It's really important to acknowledge the difficulties and the struggles.
Absolutely. Joan, I saw your hand go up. You're on mute, Joan. Yeah, that's it.
Got me now. Sorry. I've been locked down since middle of March because my husband is not particularly well, and I listen a lot to UCB radio. And a couple of weeks ago, they recommend. Well, I heard a lady being interviewed, and I said to my husband, "I've got to have that book. I've got to read it." I don't know whether you've come across it. It's called "Teach Me to Feel."
Right. Yeah, I have heard of it.
"Teach Me to Feel" by Courtney Riceley, I think her name is. And it's about the Psalms, and it really is amazing. I found it very, very helpful. She looks at how difficult some, David and people found it, and what they were saying. But equally, there are lovely ones about being thankful and grateful. And it's really blessed me, has that book. It's made me realise a lot more. I mean, I have prayed, I've been married for 42 years, and I prayed for my husband to be saved for 42 years. And would you believe, during lockdown, he's come back to God. And I just find that absolutely amazing. And I went out yesterday, somebody said to me yesterday morning on a prayer group that I meet with in the morning, you need to go out and talk to God today. You need to go out and find him in the quiet. And we have a beautiful garden around where we're staying. I went round the garden and I felt God say to me, that intercession is now over. You've interceded for 42 years and now it's over. And you can leave your husband with me.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
And I just find, it's been hard. It's been tough at times. It's really tough to be a Christian when you're living with somebody who isn't. But yeah, that book, talking about songs and talking about how, I have been in churches where I thought everything had to be rosy, everything had to be, if people weren't healed, then we weren't praying hard enough, for that kind of attitude. And for me, this book just brought the whole thing into reality and truth. And God has been in with me. He's been in the last 42 years with me, despite it being tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joe.
I think that is the key. Sorry, Jason, carry on.
I just said thank you. You go.
Yeah. I had this real instinct when I got this invitation, and I don't follow a lot. I've been in a live church for quite a long time, and recently I felt God moving me back into the Anglican Church. I had no idea why. It's not my thing really, or I didn't think it was, but it was for my husband. It was definitely from a husband. It's brought him back to God. And I've seen the ground level invitations. I've never taken any notice of them, but this one I really felt God wanted me to join in with you. And thank you very much, Richard. It was great.
Well, the script of what I've written will be available if people want it. So
I loved what you said, Richard. Just a really simple sentence, but really great, was about God is wrathful because he is good, not in spite of it, but because he's love. Yeah, and that's great. That's
yeah. In fact, before you said that, as you were leading up to the argument, I just thought, well, if God wasn't angry at some of the things that go on in the world, he doesn't care, does he?
no, that's right, exactly.
You can't, it seems to me. Just coming back to the earlier point, and thank you for sharing, the lady in Norwich. Are you in Norwich?
Well, I'm actually in Yorkshire at the moment, but I'm from Norwich. Yes.
But the word sort of authenticity came to mind, and I think that certainly speaking to a lot of young people, what they're looking for is authenticity. In other words, a faith that is able to engage in all kinds of situations. And sometimes I don't think they are impressed by triumphalism, which doesn't actually necessarily address some of the issues that we're grappling with, really. And I think you've encouraged us to be authentic, Richard. Really. And the other thought that came to me was the way that Dickens starts A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times and the worst of times, and you almost like a parallel. You almost have great things happening in the lives of people, and the kingdom is advancing, and yet at the same time there can be all manner of things happening and going off around us. And we can tend to focus on. We can tend to lose our perspective because we're focusing on all the bad stuff, but in reality, the good stuff is going on. And I was reminded of the parable of the tares and the weeds, and also the wheat that's been sown, where you get the wheat and the tares growing up together, and it can be quite difficult to distinguish, but it grows together until the end of the age. And maybe that's where we're at.
Something of what we're seeing now. The fruition of the two kingdoms in parallel.
Brilliant.
just thinking as well as about Jesus weeping about Lazarus.
Yeah.
Even though he was going to be raised from the dead, he still wept.
Right. He entered into the suffering of the sisters and of those around. In his humanity, he did that.
Yeah.
And that is a wonderful, wonderful moment.
Yeah.
I'd be really, it'd be great if you could thank your sister, because I found her account really quite moving, and do pass on thanks to her. That's very powerful testimony.
As you were sharing about the life of Jesus, the sufferings of Jesus, I was reminded, I think, of Steve Chalke's controversial comment, wasn't it, about cosmic
child abuse?
Yeah, and and I thought, I was asking myself, well, where was the Father when Jesus was suffering?
Yeah.
And the verse came to me, 2 Corinthians 5:19, God was in Christ reconciling the world. So actually, probably, and I've heard it described as his arms were outstretched behind the cross. He wasn't on the cross, but he was there, entering into that suffering.
That's right. And that's Moltmann's argument in The Crucified God. Which is worth a read.
Yes, I've read it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. If anyone has got any other burning comments or questions, fire away now, or we'll round up.
Where did you say the notes will be, Richard?
I've passed them to Steph, so I'm assuming they can be obtained from Steph.
I can get them emailed to you if you like, Helen. Would anyone else like the notes?
Yes, please. Yep.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Yep.
You can find my name on the system.
Yeah, Joni, you on our mailing list?
Yes.
Right.
Well, I'm on the emailing list.
We'll have your details then. I'll get those sent out to you all. That's no problem at all.
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you.